In this video, we're going to take a look at how did the government react to protest movements. Some of the first protests were about language. This map shows that India has about hundreds of languages, and over the centuries of British rule, this resulted in English becoming the language of government, law courts, higher education, as well as the middle and upper classes of modern-day India. And so with such variety, English was just the only real uniting language overall. However, Hindi is the most popular language. 50% of the population speaks Hindi, and you can see that kind of red area in the top, in the northern region of India, but it's only spoken in the northern region. And so while a lot of the people are speaking it, it's only in that region. The Constitution recognizes 14 languages, and Hindi and English will become the official languages. The Constitution, however, did allow for the Parliament to change state boundaries, and so because Parliament can change state boundaries, a lot of the people that speak these languages are going to push Parliament to create new state borders according to these languages. So they want further splits so that these groups can have better representation in Parliament. And so here we see all these different splits that are possible to become states as the map continues to change today. Some of the first protesters were in the south, especially because they weren't too happy about the Hindi language becoming so dominant. Southern Indians called for new boundaries drawn along linguistic lines, so each state could have a recognized language. That way their language wouldn't die out. Gandhi liked the idea, he supported the idea, but Nehru's not so happy about it. He didn't want to further divide the nation. He wants just a united nation overall. And so the Telugu-speaking Andhras were the first to campaign for their own state. In 1952, Poti Sriramalu, one of their leaders, fasted to death in protest against Nehru's refusal for their own state. After he died, there were some nasty riots after his death, until 1953, when the government decides to create a new state, Andhra Pradesh, as a Telugu-speaking state. It was created out of part of the state of Tamil Nadu, which was a Tamil-speaking state. And so this new state was kind of carved out of another, so that people speaking Telugu could have their own official language in their own official state. But it did take sacrifice to get there. Other fights over language. The State's Reorganization Commission was created to investigate the issue, and in 1956 state boundaries were moved to create 14 states based on language. Not all groups were satisfied based on that map, and so more changes were made later, and they continue to be made. Riots over language in the state of Bombay, and so it was split into the states of Gujarat and Maharashtra. Punjab was further divided into the states of Punjab and Haryana. And so you can see the differences between the map in 1951, basically right after the Constitution was written and the state borders were set up, versus today, where there's a lot more division. Over time, it's been chopped up and the borders have moved around, so there's a bit of a patchwork going on in this 1951 map versus more uniformity, but it's more chopped up in this one. More protests about language. The Constitution called for the eventual phasing out of the English as the official language, with Hindi taking over, with 1965 being the goal. However, while Nehru was around, he pushed for maintaining English to satisfy the non-Hindi speaking South. And so you can see in this map up here, in areas where the areas in orange, they're still speaking a variety of regional languages. The area in red still speaking Hindi, and that's where the capital is, and where 50% of the population is. And then these smaller areas in blue where English is the dominant language. But largely you've got all these regional languages, and they wouldn't be too happy about Hindi taking over. Even on their money, 17 of the official languages of India appear on currency notes. But then Nehru died, and so after his death in 1964, Tamil speakers in southern India started to protest against the use of Hindi, because Nehru was holding it back, but now that he's gone, they're starting to get worried. Some protesters went so far as to go for self-immolation or burning themselves to death. English was not retained as the official language, but it remained the main language of interregional communication, business, and higher education. So it's still largely used to communicate between the states. It's still largely used by the government, but it's not the official language. The use of English furthers divisions between the educated elite who speak it and can afford to take the class to learn it, versus the rest of the poor population that are going to speak their local languages but don't speak English. And so you got a little map here showing the most popular languages, at least besides English. So Hindi dominates 422 million. And then you've got these other languages according to size. And so they look a lot smaller, but if you combine them all, it look more like this map of the red and the orange. And moving away from language into ethnicity and separatism. And it's hard to split them, but ethnicity is linked to issues of language as well as religion. And so there's going to be a lot of crossover here. Some of those fighting to move the state boundaries saw themselves as separate groups within their own history, culture, identity, and language. So language is almost it's a symptom or just one little part of their own unique ethnicity. Sikhs, for example, have their own language as well as their own religion. They speak Punjabi, hence they live in the Punjab. Before independence, there were 10 million Sikhs in India. Their demands for their own state were largely ignored during the partition talks, and millions left their homes in Pakistan for India once the partition happened, out of the fear that they'd be dominated in Pakistan by Muslims, and many were violently kicked out anyways. By 1951, Sikhs made up 1/3 of Indian Punjab, and they started to hold high positions in politics, business, and the army. And so here we have a more famous picture of a man carrying his wife out of Pakistan and into India, meanwhile still in the Punjab region. But they still to this day, they want a bit more. And so Akali Dal, the Army of the Immortals, very cool name, was the main Sikh political party. And they called for more control for Sikhs in their own state of the Punjab, and some went so far as to call for a completely independent country, an independent Sikh country known as Khalistan, Land of the Pure. Nehru rejected even their own separate state or province based on religious grounds. He didn't want further splits. But they kept pushing. 1955, mass demonstrations called for greater autonomy. They wanted more power in their own state. And the Indian Army said no. Nehru said no. The Indian Army invaded the Golden Temple, their holiest site in Amritsar, where the government believed was the center of the protests. So we get this pattern of the Indian Army invading this holy Sikh site, because this is going to happen again in 1984. It's not going to turn out well. 1965, after Nehru dies, the government gives in, and they create a smaller Punjab state where Sikhs are the majority. The Sikh leader Sant Fateh Singh threatened to fast to death until his new Sikh state was created. And so in many cases, Nehru was holding everything together, but as soon as he died, the government gives in. Some examples of further violence as a result of these protests. Prime Minister Indira-Gandhi, who is Nehru's daughter, and takes over just 2 years after Nehru's death. She takes over, and he dies in 64. She takes over in 66 and has a pretty strong position. She controls India for quite a while. She's in charge 1966 to 1977, takes a little break, and then comes back into power 1980 through 1984. And so she continues this Nehru-Gandhi dynasty. And even though her name is Gandhi, she is Nehru's daughter. She is simply named after Gandhi. 1984, Indira sent Indian troops into the Golden Temple to arrest the leader of a militant and violent Sikh separatist group. And so here's some Sikh men around the temple, but we started to get a little violence and threats from the Sikhs. So she sent in the army to the temple. 7 tanks were brought into the area of this holiest site, and 500 people died in the battle. So the Sikhs were going to be pretty mad after this. Her Sikh bodyguards took revenge and assassinated her. and she was shot to death. And in retaliation, 2,000 Sikhs were murdered in anti-Sikh riots. As soon as she died, the party was still in charge, and the next person really in the party was her son. And so the dynasty continues with her son, Rajiv Gandhi, who's going to be in power from 1984 to 1989. After 1989, he loses power for a bit, hoping to come back in the next election. And while he was in charge, he sent Indian troops into Sri Lanka, which was the small island nation to the south that used to be part of British India but split off. Sri Lanka had a civil war. India supported the Sri Lanka government during that civil war. And so the Indians sent in troops. And Gandhi was quoted as saying that if he takes power again, he's going to send troops again into Sri Lanka. So the main rebel army in Sri Lanka, not too happy about this, so they sent a suicide bomber to attack. And so he was assassinated by a suicide bomber from Sri Lanka's Tamil Tiger separatists. And so here's the suicide bomber. She was actually quite young. She was a teenager. And several other people were killed in the blast. Tribal communities make up 7% of India's population. And these are small communities. They live in isolation in the hills and forest areas. They have very different cultures, traditions, and languages than their neighbors. And often their neighbors are surrounding them, and they're just in these little pockets. Some of them wanted greater autonomy and recognition of their language and their culture. A couple of examples, starting with the Naga people. And some Naga people right here, this really small community over here, very close to Myanmar. And so it's kind of a border community right next to Myanmar. 500,000 people within this tribe. And under the 1950 Constitution, they included the Naga Hills as part of the province of Assam. The Naga people were not too happy about this, so they reject this and they said, nope, we're independent. And they declare independence. 1955, they start to really mean it, and so they set up an army. The Naga guerrilla fighters wage war against the Indian army. 1963, after years of fighting, a separate state of Nagaland is created. So here's some pictures of the Naga people today. Another example of a violent protest, the rural protest by peasant farmers. And so in the Telangana region of Hyderabad, there was a peasant uprising from 1947 to 1950. So this was even before Hyderabad agreed to be part of India. Large estates were seized from landlords and redistributed to the peasants. And so these people were supported by the Communist Party of India, and they're hoping that this spark a nationwide revolt where the poor would rise up against the rich. And so here we have some examples where they were training women to fight in this peasant army. Didn't work out. Thousands were killed when the police and the army rolled in to crush this revolt. And so that's a look at how the government reacted to protest movements. So in some cases it had to be violent. Other cases we had some protests that turned out okay.